A 4-day ceasefire has been reached between the YPG SDF and the Syrian government west of the Euphrates in Syria. The United States has ended its partnership with the SDF. What direction will developments take in the areas where the Syrian army has been unable to advance and along the Hasakah and Ayn al-Arab lines? We will discuss all details with On Radar with journalist Yahya Bostan. Mr. Bostan, thank you for accepting our interview. As we mentioned, extremely serious developments are unfolding in the Middle East. A 14-point agreement has been reached between the Syrian government and the terrorist organization YPG SDF. At the same time, the United States announced that its partnership with the SDF has ended. So what kind of impact will this have on the terrorist organization YPG SDF, and what are we like to see in the period ahead?
When the Damascus administration launched its operations, it first moved from Aleppo and then turned toward Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. And something significant happened there. Arab tribes broke away from the SDF and began acting alongside the Syrian government. Therefore, in reality, we now need to describe this situation differently. The SDF has effectively ceased to exist. What remains is the YPG. The YPG, which is an extension of the PKK and Candle, already constituted only a small portion of the SDF. Now, only the YPG is left. And where have they been cornered? They have been squeezed into the Ayn al-Arab region. It is a very small area. They are also currently present in Hasakah. The trajectory of this issue is as follows. The deadline that has been given expires this Saturday. After Saturday, if the YPG does not lay down its arms and integrate into Damascus, which is quite possible because we have seen them backtrack just one day after signing agreements with electronic signatures, they may do so again. If the YPG does not disarm, two scenarios are on the table. The first scenario is this. The Damascus administration could carry out neighborhood-by-neighborhood operations in both Ayn al-Arab and Hasakah, forcing the YPG to surrender. This is the most prominent option. The Syrian government advanced very rapidly, and now that it holds a strong position at the negotiating table, it may want to bring this issue to a final conclusion without delay. This is the most logical outcome. The managed trains controls the west and south. In this situation, the only thing Damascus needs to do is seal off the Iraqi border along the eastern side of Hasakah. Once that is done, and they have already cut the Sinjar logistics route, meaning the arms supply lines from Sinjar to the YPG have been severed, after the Iraqi border is fully closed, we would see two completely isolated, small patches of territory. In this second scenario, there would no longer even be a need to fire weapons, because at that point, the organization would be fully encircled. Even if Damascus does not launch direct operations, the YPG would have no room left to maneuver or even to breathe, and eventually, it would be forced to surrender on its own. So there are two possibilities. Either this process ends through armed operations, or it concludes without weapons, spread out over time. But I do not believe the Damascus administration will want to waste time.
So, will the SDF end up the same way as the actors who cooperated with the United States in Afghanistan?
They have no choice but to surrender. This is over. The Syrian issue is essentially over now, because the region's entire infrastructure had already been shaped accordingly. Let me put it this way. The YPG, what I would call the Syrian PKK, was trying to position itself completely against the prevailing regional dynamics. But there is a saying, you cannot row against the current. The Syrian PKK tried to row against the current. The United States, Turkey, and Syria, the Damascus administration, reached an understanding back in November. They agreed on preserving Syria's territorial integrity. The overall climate had already taken shape in that direction. To the north, there is a very strong country, Turkey, and Turkey firmly supports Syria's territorial integrity. In this context, it provides very strong backing. At the same time, Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia, are supporting the Damascus administration. Financially, Damascus has begun to overcome its difficulties. In areas outside SDF control, we have already started to see a relative improvement. The Syrian government had begun to stand on solid ground. Yet, despite a process in which the entire regional and international environment was shifting in favor of Damascus, the Syrian PKK chose to resist the current. But the nature of reality does not allow that. And where we stand today clearly proves it.
The Syrian army continues to advance, particularly in Hasakah and Ayn al-Arab. However, we cannot say that it has established full control yet. So why, in your view, has the Syrian army not been able to advance completely?
In those earlier areas, when Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa fell very quickly, the main reason was the demographic structure. The population there was predominantly Arab. Once the Arab tribes withdrew, those areas effectively collapsed on their own. But now, in Ayn al-Arab and in parts of Hasakah, especially around Kayışlı, where the Syrian PKK has been cornered, there is a dense Kurdish population. When conducting operations in areas with a high concentration of Kurdish civilians, you have to be extremely careful to protect civilians. Throughout this entire operation, the Damascus administration has acted with the seriousness of a state. It has been very careful to preserve legitimacy. For example, before entering those two neighborhoods in Aleppo, Ashrafia and Sheikh Maksud, it opened humanitarian corridors. It ensured that civilians could leave the area, and only then did it carry out military operations. Because when you are a state, sensitivity towards civilians must be at the highest level. But since the Syrian PKK is a terrorist organization, it thinks with an organizational, militant mindset. That is why it believes it can use civilians as human shields. And this is precisely why, even after withdrawing from certain areas, it is still seeking ways not to lay down its arms. So if you ask why the Damascus administration does not move directly into these areas, the answer is to prevent harm to the civilian population. While restoring the country's territorial integrity, it is trying not to create resentment in the hearts of the Kurdish population. And this is the correct strategy.
We can say that a new integration process has begun between the Syrian government and the YPG. But looking ahead, will the process result in political unity centered in Damascus, or could a different system emerge because they are demanding autonomy?
Şimdi şöyle, bu biliyorsunuz 10 Mart Anlaşması.
The March 10th agreement was one thing. The agreement signed on January 18th, the 14-point agreement, is something entirely different. If the SDF, in other words, the Syrian PKK, had complied with and accepted the March 10 agreement, it would be in a much stronger position today. But as Thomas Barrack also pointed out, they constantly want yesterday's agreement. As a result, their position keeps weakening. At this point, there is no scenario in which the Syrian PKK integrates into Damascus by demanding autonomy or special status. The Damascus administration does not accept this anyway. From now on, the only option for the Syrian PKK is to comply with this 14-point agreement, the agreement they have already signed, and to integrate into the Syrian state on an individual basis. There is only one clause in the agreement that refers to the Hasakah region, suggesting that the Syrian army would not directly enter certain areas and that a form of local administration could take shape there. But ultimately, in an environment where the Syrian army ensures border security and overall security, this does not mean that autonomy or special status has been granted. This 14-point agreement genuinely secures Syria's territorial integrity in a very serious way. The Syrian PKK has no option other than to comply with it. They are now facing only two possible outcomes. Either they lay down their arms and fully abide by this 14-point agreement, or they will disappear altogether. Because look at what remains at this point. The Damascus administration under al-Sharaa has already granted significant rights through the Kurdish Rights Decree, covering a very broad spectrum, from education to political participation. These are basic human rights, and they have already been acknowledged and guaranteed. So the Damascus administration does not have a negative stance, so to speak, regarding Kurdish rights. The only real issue being debated right now is this: will you lay down your arms, or will you not? Will you say yes to the authority of the Syrian army, the security forces, state institutions, and state control in those regions, or will you not? The Syrian PKK no longer has the chance, the luxury, the capacity, or the leverage to say no. This issue is over.
Şans, lüksü, imkanı, kapasitesi yok artık. Bu iş bitti yani.